Welcome to the audience, to those dialing in with us. Thank you for attending. And to our keynote speaker, Mr. Alain Colchou, bienvenue à Saïd. We're honored to have you here today to impart your expert insights into what I'm sure is arguably one of the biggest barriers to development in Africa.
Absolutely.
So, Mr. Nkonchu, Africa's swelling debts balance has inextricably cast a long shadow over its economic development and growth. Over the last decade alone, we've seen that the average debt ratio across sub-Saharan Africa has almost doubled and increased from 30% in 2013 to almost 60% by the end of 2022. Reports even suggest that the ratio could rise a further 10% over the next 5 years if the region's fiscal trajectory doesn't change. Broadly, we know that the arduous economic shocks that have driven currency devaluations and rising interest rates have all made debt repayments difficult. And taking a step back, if we look at the status quo across many countries across the continent, we also see that the status quo makes the opportunity to enforce debt austerity more difficult and less obvious. To kick us off, could you walk us through the financial journey that African governments have taken post-independence and maybe describe some of the key factors that have characterized the journey to where we stand today?
Super. Thank you for having me. And before starting anything, I would like to acknowledge the No Women International Days and congratulate you for that.
Thank you.
Oh my God. And yes, this is, the subject of the African debt is one of a very pressing one. And like you mentioned, probably to understand where we are now, it's good to go through the journey. How did we get there? And essentially, since the independence years of the early 60s, we've had an environment where African government had access to debt, essentially on a multilateral basis, with an environment where commodity price was also satisfactory. And we basically use those debt to invest and sometimes to spend, up to the point where it's the 70s, 80s, with the environment becoming a bit more restrictive, if you remember, with the 74, the top of the inflation cycle in the US, we actually faced our first crisis, which led to the Special Adjustment Program that was led by the World Bank and the IMF. And one thing that happened during that adjustment was essentially a very tight microenvironment. Fiscal policy was tightened, monetary policy was also tightened, and those countries were required also to disinvest, to basically privatize. And obviously, this kind of condition creates growth construction and quite a bit of resentment, across Africa. But that was the first stage of really the debt adjustment, which is very, very telling. And then the second wave comes into the 1990s with what was called the HICP, heavily indebted, poor countries. And that was an initiative, again, by the World Bank, which led to debt forgiveness, but also the creation of maybe what you remember, which was the Brady bonds. Second stage. And the last one within this part of the cycle was basically, during the 2005, what we call the multilateral debt relief initiatives. Essentially, again, led by the World Bank, 100 billion was basically canceled in form of debt for 37 countries, among them 30 countries were African countries. So now we get into the 2005 years, so basically both before the GFC crisis. And how Africa find itself in an environment where the stock of debt that you can see is at the lowest.
Right.
Essentially, like you mentioned, 25% of GDP. But also it corresponds at a time when globally inflation is low, especially in the developed world, interest rates are low, and there is a need, or at least there is a quest from the external world to reach for yield. So Africa found itself in an environment where the debt stock was relatively low, growth were relatively strong because commodity price was also higher, and when I say strong, we're talking about around 10%, which is still around potential. So we had an environment where, and also China basically looking to basically acquire more and more commodities and therefore investing in Africa. We had an environment where we went into a new phase of debt ramp up. due essentially to the difference in terms of yield that Africa was offering, the lower debt stock, and the strong economic environment. These went on until the mid-2014. And then it was around that period we had a shock. We had the first shock, which was basically the commodity price coming down and the environment changing somewhat. But still, the debt ramp-up continues. But what was actually already showing is that the growth potential, or at least the actual growth during that period, from the 2014, was essentially has come down to around 5%. And with that lower growth, the ability to service that debt was in the background, clearly diminishing. But then the debt stocks basically was increasing, systematically.
Right.
So where did we end up now? Obviously during that period, we came on to 2024, then we start ramping the debt stock. But then we end up in an environment where you look back, you also had, post the 2024, you have, basically the COVID crisis. That was the latest one, which led to quite a large fiscal expansion across the continent, just like anywhere else. As we know, this expansion also happened in the US. And the debt stock increased, yield were low, but then growth were also relatively weak. As we know, it was a shock of demand and supply, so therefore those economies contracted like anyone else, except that coming out of that crisis, as we know, we had the global inflationary pressures, which led to basically higher nominal interest rate in the US, but also removal of capital across Africa. So we were facing a situation where within that period, or at least up to this point, like you mentioned, the debt stock in Africa have gone almost up to 65-70%, depending on the country, and basically growing by fivefold, between 2000 and 2020 to almost 700 billion, among which 160 was essentially China. China is 12% now of the total debt, within Africa. So that also had something in itself, which is going to explain the pressure that we actually are facing today. Is that 3/4 now of this debt is commercial. It's basically a commercial debt as opposed to bilateral, which means that they tend to have short-term maturity. They tend to basically be very market sensitive, and they tend to also, on being negotiable. So that creates a certain form of instability because guess what? There is a price, that is visible to that debt. Yes. So this is the condition within which Africa is finding itself today, to the point where we are now having, and we had some default that actually happened. We know we have Zambia, we have Ghana, more or less Ethiopia on the brink, and this is the situation and this is the dynamic within which we are now. And the question has been for most of the country, the ability to roll over that debt as opposed to basically defaulting, as sometimes could be the case. So the debt stock has gone to a level where we understand that the ability to withstand the shock is pretty limited, as you can see, and yet restructuration hasn't really happened in a large scale, as you see on the far right. So the future now holds between those governments being able to basically to act, on those parameters, given that it's a challenging world. Competition with capital is intense. Growth is relatively slow. Commodity price is still the vehicle of essential growth, but the ability to service it, becomes challenging. And what is key is the ability to be able to roll over that debt, which, as we speak, has been created by the expectation of the Federal Reserve cutting interest rate. But whether that happens or not, we'll see. But surely now a lot of countries have gone into the market to try to reprofile that debt, and getting away from that perception that they will not be able to serve it. That's the case of Kenya recently, Ivory Coast and the like. So this is more or less where we are now. The question, or maybe the following up, is that what should an African country do at this point, on the short term? Maybe I'm preempting what you wanted to say.
Yes.
I guess, unfortunately, and maybe for that we need to go back a bit into our growth model, right? These are economies that has essentially commodity-based by and large, with relatively strong, young population, low savings. At $1,700 per head, income per head, there's not much room for you to actually have, create pent-up savings to fund investment, and in the strong need of structural investment, let's say productivity enhancing investments, which means that they are structurally net capital importers. And by that virtue, net capital importers, it means also that more than often they tend to run a negative balance of payment, which means a relatively weaker currency. So, and a relatively higher inflation for that matters. So this is where we find ourselves now, for relatively large debt stocks, a market that is not really open to allow those countries to roll over the debt stocks, with a growth that is way below potential and do not allow us to basically service it very comfortably unless give any margin for any shocks. And what do actually those countries need to do, in the short term? Clearly, re-anchor, basically setting up explicit debt target, that integrate the trade-off between debt sustainability and also investment. Those governments need to continue to invest because the growth potential is much higher than what they actually are having now, right? So that's one thing. Second, setting, ambitious primary surplus. We are talking about the World Bank will tell you 1%, 1.5%, 2%. There's no other way. Basically reducing the spending to a certain extent, right? Try to find a way to increase revenue mobilization. At this stage, to give you just an example, you see what I mean? The revenue to GDP in African government is about 17%. If you compare it to the developed world, we are talking about 45, 50. Just to give you the kind of bracket. So we said anchoring fiscal deficit, which is basically setting up a certain target when it comes to debt, but taking into account the trade-off between spending and debt sustainability. Okay, setting an ambitious primary surplus, you see what I mean? Increase revenue mobilization. But then again, the next stage is try to change, or at least set up the path to change the debt composition away from hard currency into local currency. Just imagine if you are borrowing the capital that you needed, for those investments in the currency that you are not able to generate, or at least which is not yours, then you actually are subject to external shock by definition. So rebalancing that basically means that you find ways to basically pay off what you have, but also promote your own domestic market to a certain extent. But promoting your domestic market means that you need to basically sell to, or at least give them the confidence that your policy is going to actually be sustaining inflation, containing inflation to an extent. That nominal interest rate will be at level that actually are quite sensible. If I come to invest in your debt, I have to be sure that it's not going to be eaten up by, by inflation or maybe currency devaluation down the road. So what comes with that, and which is actually a making of the structural way about how to, let's say, macro policies run for most of those countries, unfortunately, is tight monetary policy at the margin. Why? Because if you accept that you have your structure of the economy is such that the underlying trend of the inflation of the currency is one in which it tends to weaken, and it tends to weaken by step function, because weakening or at least devaluing currency, like it has happened in many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa lately, is not about competitive devaluation. It's almost, let's say, a form of throwing the towel, because as you keep accumulate, you see what I mean, imbalances in the form of, in terms of deficit, from balance of payment, at some point, with the scarcity of hard currency, you have to let it go. And if you don't, inflation keeps piling up. And monetary policy at some point has its own limit. In other words, there is a level of interest rate at which monetary policy may become ineffective. So you need to ensure that the monetary conditions are tight enough to keep a lead on inflation and the currency down the road, so that nominal interest rate, even though they stay high, stay at the level where people are confident that, the currency is actually, going to, be contained, or at least the pressure is going to be contained. This is almost like you have to press a bit on tight conditions, and on top of that, looking at your spending very carefully, which is not really conducive of growth. But without that condition, you are always facing headwinds. So this is, and whichever we look at, they are very challenging parameters as far as our economies are concerned.
Yes.
And that leads also to say, this could not be a permanent state of affair. We have to do it because that's the price to pay considering where we are now. The debt stock is too high. The margin to basically absorb shock is relatively limited. If you need to take it down or even contain it, you need to go through that process. Anchoring the currency, rebalancing your debt, the debt stock from away from a hard to local, and tightened monetary and fiscal policy at the same time. This is not conducive for positive growth, for sure. But then you have to go through that. It's a sort of J-curve in order to get out of it. Now, what do we need to do over the long-term reform in this kind of environment? I think there are something that has to be accepted from our point of view. Wherever you talk about an African country, most of the time, it's all about what kind of resource do the country have. We should get away from this notion of deriving our wealth from resources. Revenue from resources should be considered as a windfall, as a shock absorber, not as a permanent way of living, and focus on tapping on the productivity of our labor and the capital at the same time. In other words, and one thing that other countries sometimes have experienced is that when it comes to resources, let's go for one-third, one-third. One-third current investment, one-third is current spending, and one-third, future generation. And nothing changed out of that. So we push the economy to create more wealth out of what actually is an income that comes, from without really a huge participation from labor or what have you, and also very subject to cycle. Second one, I think, is being accountable to what is used in terms of debt. If you think about what has happened in terms of the debt stock since the independence days, as you can see, the whole variation has been either accumulation or reduction of stock. Right. But in no way you can see a consistent reduction of the stock due to the fact that we have been able to deliver an excess return from the cost of that borrowing. So therefore, all the decrease in that debt stock has been in form of debt relief. So we need to make our officials accountable to what or how that capital has been used. In other words, to be able to see and measure the multiplier. In some cases, it can be just you borrow vastly to invest and not to fund spending. And one of the third point, is essential also to look how we can rebalance or really think about reviewing what is our also weakness within that process, which is the composition of the balance of payment. We import too many goods that we need for ourselves, right? And try to be serious about how we substitute that for local production. It can be food, which is one of them, but clearly be strategic about that, which will go also a long way, is what I mean, in addressing the issue of balance of payment in that process. Maybe I spoke a bit too long, but
no.
If you have any...
You've covered a lot of upcoming questions, but
yep.
You've also got my mind ticking, and I have some more. So
please.
Thank you for that comprehensive introduction to how we look at sovereign debt. You touched a bit on, and maybe I will drill down on the restructures, which I think we have up on screen right now.
Absolutely.
You've highlighted that over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of restructuring, and we've also seen some sort of inability to roll over debts and maneuver there.
Due to market conditions, yeah.
Yes. So we've spoken about Ghana, which raised or restructured about $5.4 billion of loans earlier this year.
Sadly, it's not completed yet, but the process is there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Curious about the likelihood of that completion, but I'll park it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then you touched on Kenya as well, which issued a new bond at an eye-watering yield of about 10.4% earlier this year to avoid a default. on an upcoming bond later.
The default was a perception. The
Right.
fact is that it was market condition creating, anticipating a potential default, which clearly was not an issue. But that's a point.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Based on everything you've described and the factors that you've highlighted that have gotten us here, in your view, I mean, there's a lot of talk about the state of sovereign debt across the continent. Would you say that we're in a debt crisis? I know everyone keeps tiptoeing around this word. What do you think?
Okay, I mean, there is a lot of components to what you're saying. The truth is, the narrative is very easy, to shift into the notion of debt crisis based on what we see around us, okay? That narrative was actually very strong last year at the time when there was no perception of the top of the rate cycle in the US. And obviously with, money market fund at 5.5% or 6%, what have you, in dollar, the threshold for somebody to basically be willing to add a bit more and go into frontier areas is actually high. So what you've had is capital withdrawing from emerging market. Africa is included in that, but also the perception that there was no willing buyer or takers of that risk at some point. So with a market closed, or access to market closed, and which has been the case up until recently, the perception was nobody could see through any analysis of debt sustainability, bearing in mind the fact that you also have the multilateral who could have come, and gave some, exempt some loan. But the perception was that in absence of a market that allows those countries to roll up the debt, surely the risk of default was increasing. And it got itself into that narrative to actually even price it into those assets. Hence also the danger for some of those to actually basically go through the market. But the good thing is that it is transparent. And that's actually what happened in the case of Kenya, where the perception was that if they don't have access to the market, therefore they might default. But I don't think there was any case for Kenya to actually be defaulting, because as far as we are concerned, they had also solution, which was bilateral lending or, maybe the World Bank and so forth. So that was more like a person than anything. Now, talking about the debt relief process, the reality, the fact of the matter is that, and that's something that you learn even as a banker, is that you lend money in good faith and with the understanding that the borrower will do whatever it takes to actually pay you back. But things happen, and there could be some conditions that do not allow the borrower to pay back. It goes for countries as much as, for private sector. And in this particular case, we've had Zambia 3 years ago, we had Ethiopia, and now we have Ghana last year. The point is, following the COVID crisis, the World Bank put in place a mechanism, looking to solve that, first of all, recognize the notion that at some point the country cannot just pay, but at least to solve, or at least to discuss about the restructuring, to come up with a restructuring plan fast enough, with the view, of creating a fair treatment of all the creditors. That's what we call the common framework. That includes, obviously, the bilaterals like the World Bank and IMF, the Chinese, and the private creditor. The only problem is that in the case of Zambia, they've been talking for almost 3 years and nothing has really happened. So the process has been very painfully slow and basically preventing those countries to have access to the market, which all the consequences that can prevail from a growth perspective. So what Ghana is trying to do from where it stands to basically speed up that process. And we all hope that that process will actually be fast enough in order to allow the country to go back into the market, except for the fact that their starting point might be also challenging because, as you know, there was a default on the external debt, but also on the internal debt, which tend to happen, but it's quite unusual. And typically what you get from that is a shift of burden from government to the banking sector. Because guess what, they become short of capital. So yes, we all hope that this is going to be solved relatively soon, but what it shows is that the common framework has to be rethinked to make it more efficient and clearly shorter in time in terms of delivering, on debt restructuring.
Okay. Sorry, let me just make a note there.
Please.
Okay, so we've said a lot in terms of how we look at how the accumulation of debt has sort of manifested across the continent and how it's used.
Yeah.
Overall, do you think that governments have been efficient in using the debt that they've taken on to actually propel economic growth, or what's your view about that?
Listen, I mean, it's always difficult to have a view because it's also difficult to have a clear measurement about how efficiently that debt was used, which is what I was alluding is that we need to come up with a clear framework of measuring multiplier, right? Yeah. Now, that's the way it is, right? And one way of asking that question is that how much growth or excess growth do we got, just what I mean, from, getting a certain unit of debt? It's always a difficult question, to be honest. It's always a difficult question, but there's no doubt that as long as governments are focused on increasing productivity, which is education of the labor, is what I mean, and productivity of capital, and making sure that even within their own economic environment, they create an environment where the banking sector, you see what I mean, is able to channel and to expand money in a way that allows private sector to basically have access to capital that allows them to do the needed investment in the economy. That should be good enough. But at the same time, you have to say that, by and large, again, more than ever, our economic growth is still very much correlated to what happens to commodities, and that's something we probably have to get ourselves away from that, away from, and tap into our, and try to be serious about tapping into our food growth potential, which go through people and the like. So it's difficult to say, has the debt, used properly or not? And by the way, the history of restructuring is across the world. And if anything, when it comes to default, Africa is not that bad compared to other places in the world, Latin America and everything. But that's the way it is. And I think when it does happen, yes, restructuring happen, debt forgiveness tend to happen, but it's probably not the best state of affair when it comes to managing those economies over the long term. Clearly not, because to take example of Zambia, it takes you quite a while to come out of that, and probably have constructive discussion to start again. So, yes, that's why, in a sense, what I'm saying is that, and this is something that we also have to be mindful, is that empowering, let's say, a government or a country, let's say a certain form of governance, to borrow, debt for a given country has to be something very serious, because a misuse of that can basically, prevent growth for the next generation. So we need to be very, very, very mindful as to how do we build, the debt stocks, and what do we do with that. That's pretty clear. In some cases, it's actually enshrined even in constitution, right? And it's even within the euro, we have convergence criteria, which allow, it's linked to the currency, but still, it shows that you need to actually come up with a framework that makes, the debt use and the debt absorption relatively more stringent than where it has been.
Okay. Thank you for that. I think I'm looking at the clock and we are running short. I want to give the audience some time to have questions as well. Okay. So perhaps let's shift the dial a bit, and in the spirit of International Women's Day and as a woman working in finance, I'm quite keen to hear your views regarding the funding gap that women entrepreneurs face across the continent. So for context, according to the African Development Bank, the funding gap for female entrepreneurs currently stands at $42 billion, which clearly places women at an immense disadvantage. Recently, Ecobank, which is the largest retail bank across the continent by geographic footprint, and where you also serve as chairman of the board, launched the Elevate program, which supports female entrepreneurs. it's also an initiative to which EcoBank has committed to allocating 10% of its loan portfolio, which is quite substantial.
Yep.
When you look at this platform that EcoBank has developed, what motivated EcoBank to develop a customized solution for female entrepreneurs in particular?
It's the recognition that, okay, overall and by and large, let's be very clear, the capital channel to the private sectors in Africa is critically low. Okay, we
Yes.
are talking about 25% of GDP. When you take this part of the world, it's 150, 40 and the like, right? So we need to do more at putting capital to work in the private sector. And at least we need to ask banks to do a bit more of that, especially given that they have an implicit sort of guarantee through the government.
Yeah.
Now, within that, and sadly, yes, the proportion allocated to women, tend to be very small,
Yeah.
and especially given the role that they play within those economies, and their also ability to basically in terms of entrepreneurship. So it's recognizing also that, in a sense, so when you look at some statistics, they tend to be more conscious about servicing the debt than men. But
Yeah.
I don't want to go into detail, but that's a fact of the numbers.
Yeah.
But what EcoBank has done is what I mean, and within that initiative, is basically to come out with this program, and where companies, the criteria has at least 50% owned by women, which will mean 20% share of women on the board of the management. That's what we have. 30% of women are unemployed. You see what I mean? And that's where we are now. The key factor, like you mentioned, 10% of commercial bank book is dedicated to Elevate, and among which focusing on women, and we have successfully financed 75,000 women businesses, providing nearly $180 million, usually generating about $460 million in deposit. Okay, and last year, Elevate program, have gone through a training of 35, women entrepreneurs, and we've also, training of within the SMEs and the like. Yes, so just to name it, it's an important point, and it's clearly proven that the multiplier is really observable, and it's not just about extending credit for the sake of taking into consideration the different gender, even from a pure financial point of view. You see what I mean? The performance is actually also good. So whatever we can do to channel capital to women and to private sector clearly is something that is almost critical as far as African economies are concerned, for sure.
And with this initiative, you've highlighted a lot of the successes of it. Are there any potential lessons learned that you guys have seen through this platform? And how do we think about that in terms of what the rest of the continent can learn and sort of mold into their structures to sort of accelerate progress towards gender parity in terms of access to funding?
I think one of the key lessons is that we should do more.
Yeah.
We can do more and we should do more, clearly. That's just because it seems to make sense from the bank perspective, we are well off and we can see the multiplier before us. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we have about 5 minutes left of the session, and so I'd like to maybe open the floor for questions. We should be getting questions through.
We'll actually just take the mic from the audience.
Oh, okay. We'll take the question from the audience directly then. Thank you. We have a question over here.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us. My name is Oyinda. I'm a third year economics student. My question's on the structure, or the lending profile of the country's lending to African states. Thank you. So my question's on the lending profile of lenders. For example, we're seeing a lot of lending coming from China, lots from the US historically, but increasingly from China with, the Belt and Road Initiative. And I'm curious to hear, I don't believe that this debt lending can be neutral politically. So I'm curious politically, the political implications of where the lending is coming from. So I'm curious to see, is there like a longer term effect? Are there kind of like political bondages being formed in lots of African nations as a result of the debt that they're taking on from certain nations. What's your opinion on that?
I'm very sorry, I don't think I've captured the question properly.
Could you perhaps rephrase it?
Please.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Non, je peux parler en français aussi si tu veux. Mais, so I'm just curious as to, so we're seeing lots of lending from China, for example.
Yes.
And I was in Nigeria recently, and I went to this Korean restaurant, and I had a picture of Xi Jinping in the restaurant. I was a bit confused.
Yeah.
So what do you think is kind of the political implication of us taking in debt from different nations that have a strategic interest in building up capital and making a name for themselves?
And I guess the truth is that, first of all, China has extended loan. As you know, they are running a surplus, right? One of the largest surplus in the world. Basically, 30% of the world surplus is in China. So they have capital, which they need to extend. And they need resources, which Africa has. So there is a condition to have a deal. And that came at a time when the usual lender were probably a bit less willing, or at least had too much condition for the satisfaction of African countries, which is the World Bank and the IMF. So it was an environment where, with low interest rates, probably less willingness, from African countries to actually go through the conditionality of the multilateral. China was actually, a good candidate. But then you had that debt ramp up that was essentially linked to those resources. And as it happened also, China is going through a different cycle now. And this is, the peak was probably in 2016 with 140 billion in one single year. 49 billion in one single year, right? But today it's less than 10. It has gone down, I think these China-Africa relationship when it comes to that was based on the fact that, we need capital, we still need capital, given our growth potential and the need investment that we have to basically develop our countries. And you just go and discuss that with those who have excess capital and capital lend. The point is, what are the conditions and what are the terms and everything? That's up to what is actually decided. But on terms of rational, we are not going to move away, or at least to turn our back, to the capital when it's out there. The true point is, what do we do with that, and how do we get the best multiplier? And that's really something for which we need to be a bit clearer and mindful to a certain extent. But then the point is, the debt stock is what it is. Do we have now the excess growth that allows us to basically contain that progression? It's not completely sure for all the countries. So I don't know whether
Hi, I'm Fatima. Just a follow-up to that question.
Please.
How is the strategic, as Oyinda just said, but how is that not reinforcing the cycle of resources and then debt? Because you said in your solution management should be, we should move to productivity and labor. But if we're lending with this same link to resources, how is not taking back the leaders back to the cycle of resources and then money and then debt?
Well, it just depends on how do you think about two things. What do you want the money to do for yourself that you are borrowing? And how do you expect to pay for it? Now, if you actually are focusing only on the resources to pay for it, guess what? You are exposing yourself to hard currency and the commodity cycle, which you have no control on. So depending on the stock of debt that you have accumulated, you may find yourself in a very difficult situation depending on the price. That's why, in a sense, in many African countries, you can read the next two years of macro according to where oil price is or has been in a relatively short term, which, it is what it is, but that's how correlated it is. You see what I mean? And so what I'm just saying is that if we need that money so much, and you have resources to basically pay for it, you have to be mindful as to how much tolerance, how much shock you can absorb if indeed, you see what I mean, your revenues were coming from those resources on which you have no bearing in terms of the quantity, the quality, and the amount of money. But then, if you had an environment where by tapping to, let's say, local productivity. And you develop a local market where you have people who have jobs, who can consume, and you have an internal market. Now we are talking about the wholesale client, everything. Okay, fine. But if you have such an environment, not only you have means of absorbing shock because you have a strong internal demand and a strong internal dynamic, but at the same time you're making yourself less vulnerable to external shock. Does that?
That was excellent. I think let's take one last question from the floor. You can give it to the gentleman in the
Okay, thank you. My name is Oluseyi from Nigeria. And the question I would like to ask is around your recommendations for a better strategy for countries on, when they take debts for services. So an example is Nigeria, where debts are taken for rail and for roads, right? But we have cases where, because of the broken trust between citizens and government, sometimes there's always an expectation that the roads shouldn't be tolled, right? So that means that it takes a longer time to recoup funds from the road construction. And then there's every chance that the tickets for trains, for instance, are subsidized. So there's never a chance that the government would likely make the money back from those projects. What do you recommend is, and so in many cases, we find out that these governments keep returning to take on, they return to increase their debt stock, like has happened in Nigeria, where after borrowing from China and many of these countries, we hear of things like the Ways and Means and other local debt portfolios that have built up.
I guess. Let me put it this way, okay? The idea is not to have a measurement in terms of return or what the government really have put in, like measurable return. Let's say the toll road, even just the road, by the simple virtue of the fact that it saves time of transit between two, let's say, cities who have a certain level of trade, that's good enough. But you are not going to see the return on the toll, but you are going to see on the return of the overall increase in activity that hopefully will generate some taxes. Okay? So this is another way to view how government can actually act, when it comes to productivity enhancing investment. It doesn't really have to be measurable from what the government receives from that investment. It's the second order, the trickle down, that you're actually trying to achieve. It's the same thing when you invest in a university, right, or in school for that matters, right? It costs a lot of money over time. It's capital stock, that is what it is. But having a bunch of young people like you coming out, well-educated, this is something everybody wants. And at these days, in this day and age, with the demography issue that you have in other parts of the world, everybody is competing. So they are the ones who have to come up with a value proposition for you to have that kind of education for which they partially paid for, be it, but hoping that you actually come back in the country and basically provide that. You see? So that's exactly what the government should be looking. And for that, by the way, they need to have long-term view. And that should basically be corresponding to the structure of the liability book. But in that, they should also be measuring how productivity have gone up, and also, income per head also have actually evolved. So it's not, okay, I understand the $55 billion of Ways and Means, but that's another case, right? I'm sure they're addressing that. You see what I mean? Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Nkontju,
Yeah.
There are still a flood of questions coming through, and unfortunately we don't have any time left.
Yeah.
But I think this speaks volumes to what an insightful and valuable session this has been.
Cool.
So we really
you.
thank you for imparting your expertise and your insights here.
Thank you.
And yes, thank you for joining us here at Said for the Oxford Africa Business Forum.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to everyone for attending.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.